So this part of the show is where we talk about the garage, the place where we build our associated personas that the players will interact with, whether those are non-adjoined persons or, which means regular, what are considered NPCs, or perhaps they are story-related in personalities, or even in the case of recurring ones that happen all over. In this case today, we're going to be talking about building your rep. And while, yes, we're talking about the reputation as a storyteller, in particular, one of the things that really plays into that is your ability to create believable, responsive, and alive feeling non enjoying person or NPCs. And so we're going to talk about some quick steps that can do that. The first of those is in the narrative details. So, for example, if they are walking into a bakery to talk to a baker, then think about what that person would be doing as they walk in so that the narrative details match the person they expect to see. So, therefore, they reduce their defense lines and actually see that person as a possibility. In other words, if you just say you go into a baker and you see somebody behind a counter, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to them seeing him as a baker. But if that person is elbows deep in flour and he's kneading away on a large loaf of bread or something, it gives the idea that, okay, this is indeed a baker. Or perhaps he's decorating a cake or whatever, in which case they know that he's a baker as well. But these ideas of building narrative details really give your players the opportunity to be a part of the story by engaging with the personality and the physicality of the person that they're seeing. Next among that would also be the idea of those memorable features, and those are the things that the person says or does that fits the mental picture of what they would be expecting. So a baker who's wearing a baker's hat, obviously, or he's got an apron on that's got powder and flavoring colors and everything all over him. He's seen, therefore, as a person that they might be able to interact with. Not only that, if it's a rep, if it's a recurring person they're going to be engaging with week over week over week, maybe there's some things about him that they may be able to see when he's walking down the street. Perhaps he wobbles a bit from the amount of times that he's had to walk up and down the street, or maybe he likes what he makes and so therefore he's a little rotund. You can build these memorable features into that description so that later on you can drop a hint about that person being in the room without them actually remembering his name, but they'll go, oh, that was the town's baker, I remember that. Or maybe it's an aroma. If my grandmother was a baker and she was particularly noted in her city for her maple bars. She made what we called long johns, but these maple coated blocks of dough. They were just so flaky and just so good, just so. But the idea is that you build into the non-enjoyed person, the NPC you're trying to build, something that makes them stick in their minds. We'll talk a little bit more about that in another section in a minute. But the idea is that you make them memorable so that every time they show up, the players feel familiarity for them. Wow, my lips aren't working today. I just brushed my teeth and they're not quite straight yet. Anyway, another thing perhaps is consider their natural tendencies. If it's a baker, he probably, if he has an itch, he scratches with a part of his hand that is not actually going to be involved in the baking, because that's something that a baker would be constantly conscientious about. And so perhaps he has these natural tendencies that provide themselves. Like, for example, let's say he's an Italian cook. Maybe he has a different kind of a sneeze mechanism because he's more concerned about that than he is about anything else. So you have to choose what natural tendencies you want to bring out in your recurring personalities, because that way the players can get the idea of who they are even before they see them. The next one is a connectiveness idiom, and that is, what is it that they say that reminds the players what they're doing? So in the case of the baker, perhaps he's the one who goes, hey, how'd you like the cinnamon rolls I made last week, or did you try the blah blah blah? So the idea is that you build into it some reason, not only for the the player want to get to interact with this guy, but the characters have something that connects them to this individual. And this would be something that would be sticky both ways. So the non-enjoined person, the persona that they're interacting with, would have that same connection to them as well. And so he's going to bridge that gap as often as possible to make the transition of data flow simpler to resolve. And will also acknowledge the recognition of them. One of the biggest things is for the players to recognize the NPC to the point where they recognize him, call him by name and such, just as you would expect a real person would be. If you walked through the same town and saw the same person, you might actually interact with them. And then finally, why are they in this scene? And sometimes it makes sense. They are walking into the place of operation where that guy is. But if you're going to use that NPC to carry information to them someplace else, why is it there? Well, obviously, perhaps the baker is making a delivery, or maybe the baker is picking up an order, or whatever. But the idea is that you make it so that the non-enjoined person that they're interacting with, the NPC, the character that they're interacting with, is a living, breathing thing. I've got several of the game masters that I've trained over the years who have said that this is one of the biggest things that changed the way they gamed and made their games just exceptional. I have a friend of mine from New Zealand who says that this was one of the primary anchors when he started watching my videos. That was a reason to stick around, because this was something he hadn't considered before, the actual living nature of the non-enjoined persons, the individuals that the players are going to interact with, realizing they have jobs, they have occupations, they actually live in that world. It's not just the trope of the NPC standing there with a question mark over his head, right? So that's what we're going to be covering in future episodes. We'll cover different aspects of non-enjoined persons when we come to visit the garage. Now we come to the section known as the workshop, and this is fundamentally where you're doing the grist mill work of being a world builder. And while it may be a games designer as well, because the same mechanisms apply whether you're creating just story or whether you're, and I say just, whether you're creating your epic story or whether you are just working on the details of the mechanics of the game that you're playing in, the workshop is where we'll be when we talk about those kind of things. And in this case, we're going to talk a bit about the Matryoshka method. Now, I've talked about it before, or maybe pronouncing that wrong. My friends from Middle Europe will certainly correct me if that's the case. But the Matryoshka model is the idea that you can build your adventure in a sliding scale so that you can scope down, so to speak, into the project and work on the very deep details of it, or you can expand farther back and pick up a different scale and look at it from the larger version. And the reality is that the whole point of the nesting doll concept here is that each of those stages down and each of the stages up give a different level of clarity for the players to interact with. So, for example, if you were spanned out and talking about the whole of the community, the streets that interchange and things like that, you perhaps wouldn't want to have them actually deal with an interaction unless you scope down, 2 or 3 times to bring them down into the details. So perhaps you talk about the overall weather, then you talk about the local street and cleaning or details there, down to the certain building, and then that's your establishing shot for the scene. This concept of the upscale, downscale really ties well into the now famous Shrek example of adventures being like onions. They've got many, many layers, and the idea here is that each one of them is discrete and can be described in particularly extreme detail for that scene, and then you can scale up or scale down. What this means is that you'll want to be able to create discernible differences with scale so that the players will know what level of communication they're going to be getting as you give the description. So if it's, like I said, you're talking about the localized weather, then perhaps you're talking about the entire region, within a couple of days even of travel from the location, what's going on at that scale. And so you talk about what maybe some groups that moved through, some perhaps particular thing that happened, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and therefore you scale down as you get more particularly close to where where the player action will actually occur for that episode. That means you'll also have to build in some very recognizable landmarks. And by landmarks, I'm referring at each scale. So, for example, if you're talking about a community and the general weather, of course, you'd have the major thoroughfares that come into town, a few of the features, mountains, valleys, rivers, whatever that are in the area, so that they are definable in that scale so the players can keep a good handle on where you're wanting the story to develop at that point, so they can think in those terms. Because if you're not consistent on your scaling and you're talking about individual characters while describing something on this larger scale, you can cause confusion and the players don't know where to put their feet down in their interaction with you. They're not sure which one you're trying to accomplish. So by doing this in such a fashion that you're creating discrete scales and the landmarks are therefore scalable. So in the case of a city or a community, you might talk about a mountain or a river, but in the case of a local street, that's not going to be so important, but perhaps what intervening roadways come into that corner, how many different types of businesses are on that street, maybe the types of stonework of the thoroughfare. These are all things that would be applied at that scale. And then, again, going down to the establishing shot of a building, then, yeah, again, you mentioned many of the details as you can about that location. Next comes entrances, exits, and windows. And the idea here is that at each scale, you're going to have passageways, thoroughfares, rivers, mountains, all these different pathways that bring you in. And so by describing the locale as you're doing that establishing shot with the idea of where the players might go from here or where they might have come in from, these give them the outs that they need, because a person playing in a scene needs to know where these exits and entrances and windows are. And when I say windows, I'm talking about, for example, if you climb to the top of a ridge, perhaps you have a better vista on the river valley down below, and perhaps there's a dock area or a ford location or a ferry boat. Whatever those different exits, entrances, and windows need to be able to be picked out and associated with the landmarks. Now, next we go down to the next one. Go to the next one is topography, terrain, and tools. And I'm using this as kind of a general mnemonic to be able to keep the idea together in an alliterative form. The concept of topography is, what does the location look like? What kind of traffic might be allowed? What kind of vehicles might be vehicles if they're available, or steeds or whatever. What kind of terrain? Is it going to be easy to pass or difficult? Are there going to be changes? I had to get my fidget spinners because I've been using the same hand motions every time. I realize I get into that really bad habit. But the idea of knowing where and what kind of terrain they're involved with, they also need to be able to know assets and tools. We'll get a little bit more of that in the next section in the drawing room, but you need to be able to give them the idea of what kinds of things they can pick up and use, where what they do is going to matter to the scene. Because if you've made it all glossy and squared off, they see it more like a framework that they have to work around instead of a object that they can pick up and move. So just realize that you need to have a scale of those also. Then finally, when you're talking about building a scene, you need to have an idea of their assets, allies, and enemies that are in the zone. If they know that there is a particular bad guy hideout on the next block, but they're not sure which building, it gives them an opportunity to do some of the diagnosis and decision making concerning whether they're going to, break into a particular building or move to a different location or whatever, and it gives them an idea of what they can work with. Is there a friendly on the block that they can engage if they're having challenges? Is there a possibility of somebody else acting on their benefit if they get into trouble or whatever? And the idea of building your Matryoshka Matryoshka. I'm going to keep getting in trouble for that. But as you're working up and down this scale, you can pick, in the case of a very close close in action, then the allies would have to be fairly close by. If, on the other hand, you're talking about a larger scale, then perhaps you're only speaking of the Baron's house on the hill, if that's their ally or their enemy. So you have the idea of building to scale within the scale to make it something that they can engage with. Okay, now the next part we're going to talk about is the drawing room. And in the drawing room, this isn't speaking of actually drawing, although that may come into it here in a minute, but the idea of the drawing room is this is where we try to expand our thought processes on how we're going to convey information to the players. And in this case, we're going to talk about 5Ms. And the first one is kind of it's not necessarily a word I created. I've picked it up from a couple different places where I've read it, but the idea of a meme. The concept of a meme is literally something that's mnemonic. It matches in with our memory, gives us a chance to hold on to things. For example, in a fantasy setting, if you are speaking of how you're traveling and you use the word like a league or a furlong, those terms don't mean anything unless the players have gotten a good idea of what that is. And so creating a meme for them that tells them, okay, that's within trundling distance. That gives them an idea, okay, they could galump there over a period of time or whatever. And by creating these interesting verbal cues, it lets them build into their own mentality what those distances, what that positional differentiation is. Now, many people use maps, and maps are great if they are physical representations of what the players would actually be engaging with in the form of a map. Whereas if you are actually describing something and they're able to pull out a physical map to be able to visualize it, that can be sort of problematic, except that it makes the players feel better. So, oh, by the way, there's Phobomancer. Hey, welcome. Thanks for being here. Make sure you like and subscribe so you get all of the updates on whenever I'm making new videos. That'd be really great. And that's very funny that you're throwing a rabbit to the ground. That's very funny. I think that's what that is. I don't want to mention what I think it might also be, so I'll leave it there. But the idea is that the maps are good, especially if you're at that larger scale of your Matryoshka and you're looking down on the location. But it's kind of problematic if you're actually pulling it out for the next part, which is measurements. So this is historically the way back in my day, when I was a youngster, you would draw your map, but then you, instead of giving the players the map to work with, you would have them create their own map. And so you'd be giving a very deep description of space for them. So you would be saying, as you get to the doorway, it is a 5-foot standard doorway, 7 feet tall, and it's got a metal brass handle on the right hand side. The hinges are on the left, so obviously the doors will be opening towards you. As you prepare to open that door, you notice that the space across to the other side of the room is 18 feet, and to the left and the right of that opposite door are torch sconces mounted to the walls, although they don't have any torches in them, so the room is still relatively dimly lit. The room is twice as wide as it is long. So if I've described it as being 15 feet across, then it's 30 feet wide. And then you'd have to describe, is that 20 feet to one side and 10 feet to the other? Or are you in the corner? Are you in the center? And all those kind of very deep details give the characters a fairly apt description of what they're looking at. But it's sometimes hard to visualize. If somebody says something is 4 meters across or 4 yards across, and you're not familiar with what that would actually look like, it becomes an abstract, and therefore you've got to ask more questions and such. So the idea of measurements can be problematic. Of course, then there's the alternative to going ultra detailed, where you actually have miniatures on a table describing the location, in which case that whole conversation I had about Matryoshka scale and working with how big a mountain is, you're physically not going to have enough space on your tabletop to represent the mountain as well as the valley and such, unless you're playing at that much higher scale. And either which way, the idea is that the miniatures provide some assistance, but they also give some downplay because the players feel restricted or limited to what they can do based on what they can see within the scene. And then finally, motions. Are we talking about individuals that are riding across the room, or are you giving them an object and asking them how they would interact? One of my favorite things I used to do was I would buy these little hand puzzles, little objects you had to manipulate with your fingers, and I would let them know that while they're doing this, there's somebody banging on the door, so they have to work it quickly because the enemy's coming in the door, and so it gives them a physical thing to accomplish. Now, it's not necessarily one-to-one, and sometimes it's just a perception or a time pressure, and all of these things make the game feel more visceral, more realistic, more engaging, even if those actions are not a one-to-one correlation. All right, so no. I'll just go ahead and go back here. That's what I'm going to do. Alrighty. So the last thing I want to talk about, and perhaps this is, it's one of those things where I've buried the lead. The Nikos RPG mechanism is now complete. We actually have all of the system books are actually available for purchase at our website, and I'll put the link down below for that. But the reason why I want to talk to you today in this particular last section is how do we go about getting players to play that haven't before? And I'm going to ask you to invite your friends who have never played a role-play game before at all to consider taking a few minutes and joining you or watching one of these videos with me, or perhaps joining us on our Twitch channel and interacting with me, or conversely, finding a local game of Nikos RPG and giving it a shot. The NikosRPG.com website does have Roleplay Roulette as a possible engine to help you engage with roleplay in areas that you may not have considered before. And I'm telling you, this is a game mechanic that's specifically designed to bring people who have never played a roleplay game in their life into this style of engagement. And I'm going to be pushing for that with a couple of new things. One of which is I'm taking the entire collection of my Nikos Nightly News episodes and putting them into a collection of which will be available at patreon.com/Nikos. Whether you become a subscriber and get access to all those episodes, or whether you are actually I just want to purchase them from time to time, I will be putting together collections of them representing the expansion from 7th iteration forward. So there will be for example, a video collection of my old episodes by season and by show, so you can actually get that entire group of videos. It won't be, none of them are going to be concise for the whole of an iteration because I haven't been doing this long enough, but they will give you a good handle on what that particular group was doing over time. So watch for those in the near future at patreon.com. But in this particular instance, I'm going to invite you to bring your non-player to a special event that I'm going to do on Saturday, this coming Saturday, which, let's see, today is the 29th and it's a Thursday, so it would be the last day of January, and it will be on Twitch. And I'll start in the morning, probably around 9 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, and I'll run all the way till noon. And from 9 to noon, we're going to be having an ongoing conversation with players and those who would like to learn about Nikos, one-on-one, if you will, on that live stream channel. And if you are a Patreon member, you have access to our Discord. And if you are a member of the Discord, then you can actually be a communicator. You can communicate with me during that vocally, because I will be having it on my Discord channel. And my idea is to make it so that we can have some real interaction, kind of almost like an online session zero, building up on what I've already attempted to do. As you may know, I've already done several different episodes of Roleplay Roulette on Twitch, with the idea of making it a game playable by everybody. And I'd love to have you become a part of that. So that will be on Saturday. If you want more information about that, reach out to me through either my Patreon account, or you could leave a message here in the chat, and I'll endeavor to do what I can to be able to get you access to it. But I want to thank you for being here today so far, and I appreciate all of you. Now, my players who are veterans are maybe a little distressed because I did not do a Nikos News Day report for this week, but that's because I'm building it right now to put it on as the sort of inaugural episode that will be on the Patreon account for them as a special benefit of their membership. And for those of you that are participants, non-participants, you'll be able to get that information at patreon.com/Nikos. Alrighty, I have put together enough of an episode for tonight, so I'm going to be putting this to bed, so to speak. I want to thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is Nikos RPG, and we will see you in the next episode.